So let's talk about some crazy cybernetic augmented berserkers who spell bad news for just about anything that gets in range of their hammers. And yes, with a bit of support, 5 of them can bring down an Imperial Knight, and with a rather frightening amount of reliability as well. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the Cthonian Beserks, the new leagues of Votan cybernetically augmented berserkers. These guys hail from the Cthonian mining guilds, and are apparently some of the hardiest of the space dwarves around, surviving in lethal environments to go mining minerals, and they absolutely need both their wits to survive, and also a massive amount of mechanical augmentation to allow their bodies to face up to the test. They're a pretty interesting unit in 40k, both very dangerous but also relatively slow and fragile, and I feel like they are going to be a popular unit for the Votan. Starting out, let's talk over their datasheet. The Cthonian Beserks are Elite's choice for the leagues of Votan, 22 points each, and you get 5 to 10 models in a unit. They do have the core keyword, and they do have the league keyword. They don't get any sort of restriction from being from a given guild. Their stat line is an interesting one. They hit on 3s like the rest of them, and move just 5s, and they pretty much have little to no armour, only a 6+ save, making them very easy to take out with low AP weapons. However, their augmentations do show in a few different ways. They get both strength and toughness 5, so a bit harder to wound and a bit stronger. They've got 2 wounds and 3 attacks base, plus a 5+ feel no pain type save, so it does mean that you are going to need at least some volume fire to clear them. That 5+ feel no pain goes up to a 4+ feel no pain versus damage 1, so generally things like damage 2 or 3 weapons might be some of the easiest ways to bring them down. We'll go over their Wargear in a second, but they can either choose a Plasma Axe or a Concussion Maul. The Plasma Axe is Strength 6, AP 3, Damage 2, but this is the one that can go very blendy on the anti-horde mode and can get double the attacks, but dropping down slightly to Strength 5, AP 3 and Damage 1. It's kind of interesting that the only loss on the profile is 1 pip of strength, so it often doesn't matter what profile you're swinging at, and you can often justify swinging at the sweep mode against heavy vehicles and things to get around -1 damage. Otherwise, perhaps the slightly more terrifying option is the Concussion Maul, strength times 2, so a big strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3, but they do get -1 to hit. It's going to be much less strong against light infantry, but pretty massive against anything that's 3 wounds or more. We'll compare their damage in just a second. Otherwise, 1 per 5 models can take the twin concussion gauntlets that you can see on the top left here. Their strength +3, AP -2 and damage 2, and grant you an additional attack. And then also 1 per 5 can take a Mole Grenade Launcher for an extra 10 points. It gives the model +1 wound and +1 attack for being on a big base with an Ironkin support model. And then the gun itself is D6 shots at 24 inches, strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1, ignoring line of sight. It doesn't replace the model's melee war gear, so it is pretty much a direct upgrade rather than a trade out, but still it does feel a bit weirdly out of place on a very hard hitting melee unit that's fairly fragile and slow. Otherwise, beyond that, you get some cyberstimms special rules. They get to reroll their charges, and they get to fight in death if they've not already fought. Reroll charges will add to their threat range a very little bit, maybe making your average charge threat range about 8 inches rather than 7, and fights in death is a pretty scary thing, as if the enemy needs to clear them in combat, they're going to go down and cause a massive amount of damage when they do. Otherwise, for special rules, they do have Void Armor to ignore AP -1 on that 6+ save, and they do have that steady advance rule, meaning that they only advance 3 inches but ignore movement modifiers. A bit of a double-edged sword, that one, as it does mean that they're not going to be going anywhere particularly quick. Overall though, a very interesting unit, pretty slow and not all that tough, but absolutely enormous melee damage, and a very handy fights on death rule if the opponent needs to try and kill them in combat. Pretty terrifying, but also probably quite annoying to use from the Votan player's perspective, as they might be hard to deliver into combat. I was kind of curious to see which of the Plasma Axe or the Concussion Maul stacked up to be better overall. It does seem that you need to trade out the entirety of the weapons, you can't just trade out half of them, so you can't run a mix. Here are just a few numbers on the average damage output of the 2 weapons. When compared against a bunch of fairly typical 40k targets, the Plasma Axe only really wins out convincingly against 1 wound infantry, but it does so in a pretty big way there, over double the amount of damage against guardsmen or sisters of battle for example. Otherwise, on 2 wound space marines it's more or less even, but the Concussion Maul wins out big against anything 3 wounds or more, and is convincingly better against standard vehicles or hard targets with a 5+ invul and -1 damage. There are some other advantages and disadvantages though. The Plasma Axe's low strength is actually quite good with judgment tokens. If you have a few of them, then the gap's going to narrow quite a lot. The axe might also get more value out of the Cronus traits with the +1 strength, and having lower strength is also a bit less vulnerable to having its damage ruined by transhuman physiology type rules, which are quite common in 40k. The Concussion Maul, on the other hand, is also quite good for the cheap reroll hits for 1 CP that these guys can get. It'll be even more valuable on them than it is on the axe, plus at least -1 to hit means that it can't degrade any further, you can't take a further -1 to hit on top of that, so anything like Eldar Howling Banshees that are -1 to hit in combat, this thing's going to hit them just as well. Overall, out of the two, I think I lean a bit more towards the Mauls than the axes. The awesome damage to heavies is just pretty spectacular, and you might well still have enough attacks to ruin a light infantry squad, but if he had loads of judgment token support, the axes might be a bit more tempting. I was kind of interested to see the numbers on the concussion gauntlets as well. For the extra 5 points, I must admit I'm not super enthused about them. Here are the numbers after being weighted for points, and it was kind of interesting to see that after points weighting they're actually less efficient than the other weapons, so you might as well just take more berserks if you can fit them in the unit. Seems kind of underwhelming for something that's supposed to be an upgrade. I guess maybe if you're trying to pack every little iota of strength into a Sagittor or something, perhaps it could be worth the 5 points if you have them spare. Finally, I think the Mole Launcher is a bit of a weird upgrade. It's got okay damage, and it does add a little bit of toughness and an extra attack to the model, but I feel like it's just a bit of an awkward one to use. I feel like most of the time if these guys aren't charging, they're probably going to want to advance to get into a better position, rather than just moving slowly and firing off a mole grenade. For 10 points though, I suppose you could use it as a bit of a situational thing. It could potentially slow the enemy unit with its stratagem, though I do wonder if that very big base might actually stop the unit from being able to hide behind certain bits of terrain, and if it gets the unit killed, then that's a pretty bad use of 10 points. Overall, a cheap 5-man squad with concussion mauls seems like it could be an easy way to go. So how can we soup up these guys into ridiculous damage dealing potential that's going to be bringing down super heavies then? Obviously judgment tokens are great, as they are with just about every Votan unit, and they're perhaps particularly relevant on these guys with their 1 command point stratagem to reroll all hits. You could potentially use that at the same time as another unit is using the standard judgment token one. If you get to reroll all hits, you're going to be landing a lot more auto wounds on the target. Could be great for the axes in particular with their lower strength. In general, I don't really think that they need all that much support from characters. The Carl maybe could give them some rerolls, and you could have the Rampart Crest for an invul against range, plus his judgment tokens, but I think they would do just fine without the support. Otherwise, if you could coordinate the units to be about to charge some elites and have a Grimnir cast the ignores invul thing on them, having those massive concussion hammer hits go through and ignoring enemy invul saves could be really quite a big deal and potentially game changing. Finally, you could also grant them Obsec via a Warlord trait, but it seems like Einhir might be the better choice for that though, as they're a bit more tanky. Perhaps the biggest question with these guys is how they're actually going to get to combat. I feel like they're almost always going to be looking at either a Sagittor or a land fortress to get them into battle. Otherwise, I feel like they're just going to slog slowly towards the enemy and get shot. They're really quite predictable, and your opponent can basically guarantee to outcharge range them if they need to. I feel like small squads in Sagittors might be one of the most reliable ways to go. You could park them up towards a midfield objective and dare the enemy to come close. If the Sagittor gets blown up, maybe have the option to try and fall them out behind terrain, so at least that they won't get killed that same turn and can threaten a charge in the next one. Otherwise, there could be an interesting option for a deterrent threat to a land fortress. Say if that's rolling around, shooting the enemy with big guns, the enemy probably wants to try and get close to it and either lock it up or break it. Having a unit of these guys to countercharge inside could maybe make them think twice. Otherwise, you would have the option of strategic reserving them. That would only give you around a 48% chance of a 9-inch charge though, even with their reroll. Far from reliable on a unit that you're spending over 100 points on. For the leagues, the Cronus Hegemony makes their melee truly stand out, +1 attack and +1 strength, and an extra AP if you attack units with 2 or more judgment tokens, plus a really good damage stratagem for exploding sixes, which the hammers in particular really like. The damage output of these guys is okay in the other leagues, but it's absolutely spectacular here. If you want to make combat Votan work, then the Cronus Hegemony do seem like one of the best ways to go. Otherwise, I'd say the second really good league for the Chthonians is the Ymir Conglomerate. A 5+ invul save is absolutely amazing on these guys. You're pretty much going from no save to an actually solid one, makes them into a far less of a glass cannon, even though they still will die to low AP volume fire. Otherwise, I guess the Irani Surtur Regulates could get them to toughness 6, the Great Ethereans could allow you a single reroll and the judgment token boost, and I think that the custom leagues are actually quite interesting, as they could get you a +2 to charge for these guys, which does seem to be one of the best ways that you could deliver them. Not sure if it's really worth passing up the other leagues' powerful stratagems and warlord traits and things though. Finally, for stratagems, there's a 1 command point 1 to reroll all hits in melee via their cyberstimms. Pretty excellent to be able to turn off massive amounts more damage from a small unit of these. You can just have them fight normally if they're in with a threat that they can handle, but if they need to punch up against something big, then you can have this for loads more damage. Being able to heroically intervene on any Votan unit is pretty handy as well. 1 CP to get these guys into another round of combat could be awesome. Makes them a big deterrent if they're parked on an objective. Not a lot is going to be able to stand up to a phase of combat of these guys. Even if they get hit first by the unit that they're intervening into, they'll still be able to fight thanks to their fights and death rule. Putting it together, here is just one idea for a ridiculously scary damage squad to show off what these guys could do on a really good day with a bit of investment. These ones are of course for the Cronus hegemony, where they get the extra attack, extra strength, and the stratagem, and we'll have 5 models riding in a Sagittor, and if you keep the Sagittor cheap, then that's really quite a cheap loadout for 220 points for a very dangerous unit. Say for example, if they got in the position to charge something good, the target got 1 judgment token on it, maybe from a Carl, and then we decide to absolutely turn on the most damage that we possibly can by giving 2 CP for the full rerolls to hit stratagem, and also use the Cronus specific one for exploding 6s to hit in melee. Putting all that together with their basic profile and the Cronus buffs, we get 20 attacks at strength 11, AP 3 and damage 3, re-rolling all hits to hit on force, and 6s to hit both auto wound and also generate an additional hit, though the additional hit doesn't auto wound, it just needs to wound on their great strength. Putting that all together, and it means that this squad will basically have a decent chance of removing most things in the game that don't have some sort of damage cap on them. Perhaps things like Abaddon the Despoiler or Votan. They'll kill around 17 guardsmen thanks to those exploding 6s, 11 dead space marines, whether or not they're in Gravis armor, these guys don't care. In theory 38 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, or the same amount to a toughness 8 Imperial Knight, that will make one knight very very dead, or even against a pretty hard target. Say something like a Plague Burst Crawler that's toughness 8, 5 plus invul and -1 damage, you're still doing around about 20 wounds to that thing. There's just a ridiculous amount of hammer damage coming in here. It is pretty powerful that they'll still basically get this damage output even if the opponent interrupts and kills them first, thanks to fighting in death. They might be difficult to actually get into something important, but once they do, they are pretty much guaranteed to cause some hefty stacking saves, even if it does cost them their lives. Obviously, this is pretty much a best case scenario. The damage will drop off in quite big ways if you're not running Cronus or if you're not investing a pricey 2 CP per turn, and also they do of course have to make it there first. If the opponent doesn't leave something within about, say, 13 or 14 inch range of this unit, there's a good chance they're not going to make it into combat in the first place, and all this scary damage won't happen at all. Even so though, that could still be a win for the Votan player. It means that the opponent has to back off and give up more of the board to them. So overall, I do think that the Cthonian Beserks are a pretty interesting and very solid unit, though perhaps one that you don't want to be absolutely spamming and taking to maximums. They're ridiculously cheap for the potential enormous damage that they can bring. They do work well in the 2 decent Votan transports, which are kind of good as gun turrets just in the first place. And then in any league, you only need that 1 CP to flex them into massive damage with the full hit rerolls if they do need to take out something hard and dangerous. Obviously in Ymir and Cronus, I think they'll do far better than most of the other leagues, but they seem usable in all of them. We've already talked about their weaknesses quite a bit. Low AP fire will tear holes in them to an extent that it won't most other units in 40k. They are very slow, even with slow advances, and if the opponent backs off then they're not going to make it into combat. The damage could drop quite quickly if they suffer a few casualties to reprisals or Overwatch, and perhaps just in general the Votan don't really seem to struggle for big damage counter-attack units. They've got quite a lot on offer between their characters and a whole ton of close range shooting. Overall though, I still rate them as a very usable and pretty terrifying unit. They should have a very good chance of breaking just about whatever they get their hands on, and I'd be most tempted to run them maybe in small squads of 5 within transports as some meaty counter-attack units for enemies that are sallying forth to take the midfield. I feel that perhaps running too many of them might not be the best idea though, as the opponent could just drop back and shoot them a whole ton, and you might not need whole 10-man squads to kill what you catch in melee with a crazy amount of damage that even a small squad can spit out. I think if you wanted to make mass berserks work though, it would probably be better to go Ymir, as that way it makes them a bit more of a well-rounded unit, rather than just ridiculously brutal damage dealers with little defense. So anyway, let me know your take on these guys. In hindsight I do feel that maybe I was a bit harsh on them on the tier list that I made. I think small counterpunch squads can be very effective, maybe as much for board control and the threat of potential melee, just as much as the actual damage that they do when they get there. As always, looking forward to making plenty more Votan videos. I've got a fair few more units to review, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of other fun content for the leagues going forward. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. Finally, if you've enjoyed the video, I would just like to quickly mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.